Alright, so here I'm just in the process of getting the rear cradle squared up to the chassis of the car, just to make sure everything is straight before I determine the final mounting position of the torque boxes. Basically, I used a plumb bob to mark reference points on the rear of the chassis, and then on the IRS cradle as well, to measure the distance between various reference points and make sure everything is equal. So first I got my 2 reference points from the rear frame rails, and I got my 2 reference points on the IRS cradle arms. So first I'm measuring the distance between the frame rail reference point and the cradle arm reference point, and making sure the distance is the same on both sides so it's not clocked more to one side over the other. So I got those lengths to be the same. So from those reference points I was able to determine the center point for the rear of the car as well as the center point of the cradle. Now I'm going to measure the distance of the cradle arm points to the actual center line of the rear of the car. And what I mean is that's the center point between the 2 rear frame rails. So this distance should equal that distance. And the center line of the IRS cradle should be equal distance to each reference point on each side of the rear frame. So I'll give that a try. Next I'm going to do the same thing on the front frame of the car. Basically pick 2 identical spots on the front frame, plumb bob them, get my reference points and center line. Then I can run a chalk or laser line from the center line of the front frame to the center line of the rear frame. Basically match them up and see if the center line of the IRS cradle is in line with the center line of the chassis. So here's the center line of the rear frame. So how I did this is I got my wife to stand at the front of the car, took a laser level, see it shines a little laser, and I basically lined up the center point of the rear frame and the center point of the front frame. Then I was able to look at the center line of the cradle and determine whether or not the center line of the cradle was in line with the laser line, which is essentially the center line of the chassis. So that tape line in the middle right there is the center line of the cradle, and it all matched up perfectly. So now I know it's all squared up and straight. I had a chalk line laying around as well, and we tried the chalk line as well just to see, and we got the same results obviously. So now I can move on. So here you can see the extent of the frame rail modification that I had to do. Basically I ended up cutting most of that bevel out on the side of the rail because it interfered with the torque boxes. The torque boxes need to be clocked a certain way, and they need to be right up against the frame rails to clear the cradle arms and make it all fit properly. The box will be directly welded to the frame and also tied into the other side on the rockers, so it'll reinforce any cutting that I did to the frame. So I'm not worried about that. It'll be a lot stronger than it was to begin with anyways. Other than that, I'm just in the process of prepping this whole area for some epoxy primer and top coat, since once the boxes are in, none of this area will be accessible anymore, and I don't want anything to start rusting, corroding under there, so might as well do it while I can. Once that's done, I'm going to seam seal the exposed seams from cutting out the old boxes. Then I'm going to seam seal all this up here that actually wasn't sealed from the factory. It is seam sealed on the inside of the car, but not here at the bottom. This is where all that torque box metal was, so I'm not sure that it was completely necessary to seam seal it, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. And finally, once the torque boxes are in, I'll work on this back section of the pinch welds and get them nice and straight to match the rest of the rockers that I did a while back. So the fun doesn't stop there. I had to also modify the new torque boxes quite a bit to make everything fit. I have these upgraded 9/16 bolts from Full Tilt Boogie Racing. These are kind of to limit any unwanted shifting and travel in the cradle. The middle position you see here is the stock mounting location. The boxes actually have 1/2-inch holes drilled in, so I had to enlarge the middle one to 9/16 to get the bolts to actually fit through. The others I'm actually going to leave 1/2-inch in case I ever go back to a solid rear axle again, and then I can utilize the 1/2-inch bolts that fit most of the SRA control arms. Next, instead of shaving the bushings down, I ended up widening the channels for the cradle arms by expanding them with some threaded rod, bolts, and washers and whatnot, which wasn't too bad to do once I knew I had the space against the rear frame rails. Then I had to modify the backside of the torque box to get the proper clearance to allow me to clock the boxes properly against the frame rails. The top and back edges were hitting the frame rail and causing the boxes to bind up. I took quite a bit of excess metal off the back. There was like a little lip before, and I just had to completely shave that down because of the clearance issues. So while I'm prepping the torque box area for epoxy, I figured I'd finish doing the rockers as well. Once it's epoxied, it'll get a new seam sealer and top coat so that everything is well protected underneath the rocker rails. Once those rocker rails are going to be in there, I won't be able to access a lot of that area, so better to do it now. Alright, so I have some 1/8 flat stock here that I just used to make the tie-in plates for the torque boxes to mount up to the rockers. Basically made up of 3 pieces that tie in the front, bottom, and back of the torque box to the rockers so that everything will be really solid back there and tied in nicely. They'll also give it a more finished look, but if all works out, it'll also allow me to tie in the rocker rails to the torque boxes. So I took the measurements for the driver's side and cut out the plates. Then I traced them out and replicated them for the passenger side, and it's a perfect fit. So I have both sides ready to go. The top plates and bolts you saw inside the car are just there as kind of like a fail-safe, but I'm telling you right now, these boxes are not going anywhere. Everything is solid. It's going to look super good. So the frame rail side is all welded up. Just need to tie in everything on the rocker side. Those plates that I cut, the larger piece will tie in the bottom here and also along the sides with the smaller pieces.